I sat at my kitchen table in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte on my 68th birthday, watching the pot roast go cold on the stove. A birthday cake from the bakery remained inside its cardboard box, the white string still tied in a tight double knot. I had set the table for 3 people, 3 plates, 3 sets of silver, 3 chairs pulled out. But the house was completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock Helen had bought at a flea market 20 years ago. I had been sitting in that kitchen since 6:00 in the evening, waiting. It was now 8:14 when the phone on the counter finally buzzed. I didn't reach for it immediately. I let it ring 3 times, watching Julian's name light up the screen. When I finally picked it up, there was no "Happy birthday, Dad." There was no apology for being late. "Dad," Julian said, his voice flat and composed, carrying the rehearsed quality of a man who had practiced his speech in the car on the way home. "I've been thinking. Diane and I have talked about it. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about some things. You owe Leonard and Evelyn a real apology for how you acted at Christmas. We feel like you've been difficult, like you don't even try to fit in." I looked at the cake box. I thought about the pot roast, Helen's recipe, the one Julian used to beg for every year when he was a kid. "Julian," I said, my voice steady, "I set a plate for you." "Don't do that, Dad," he said, and I heard Diana's voice in the background, a soft, prompting murmur coaching him. "You have 2 choices here. You apologize to her parents sincerely, or, honestly, maybe it's time you figure out how to be on your own. We can't keep doing this." The kitchen went very quiet after that. I want you to hold on to that moment. The cake in the box, the cold dinner, the 3 chairs, and my only son telling me my options were to bend my knee to people who despised me or disappear. Hold on to it, because that moment is the center of everything I am about to tell you. "I hear you, Julian," I said. "I appreciate the clarity." Then I hung up. What Julian did not know was that by the time he made that call, I was already preparing. I am a man who pays attention. Within 2 weeks of that call, I had done things that would make Julian's face go the color of old ash when he finally found out. I had booked a one-way ticket and made sure every door he thought was open to him was locked legally, permanently, and with the precision of a builder who knows how to secure a house. I didn't leave in anger. I packed a single canvas duffel bag on a Tuesday morning in February. I didn't look in my rearview mirror when I pulled out of my driveway for the last time. I had already said my goodbyes to the only things that mattered in that house the night before. But you cannot understand the ending without understanding the beginning. And the beginning starts 41 years ago with $400, a dented Ford truck, and a name I was determined to make mean something in this city. My name is Gerald Miller. I am 68 years old. I built Miller & Sons from a single toolbox and a reputation for never cutting a corner. I raised a son I would have laid down my life for. I loved a woman for 34 years who was the best decision I ever made. And after she passed, after Helen left me alone in a house filled with her handwriting on recipe cards, and the smell of her lavender soap still lingering in the sheets, the only thing I had left in the world was Julian. This is not the story of a bitter old man. I am not bitter. Bitterness is what happens when you let your pain rot inside you. What I felt on the night of my birthday was something much cleaner. It was clarity. When you spend 4 decades building things, you learn to see the cracks in a structure long before the wall falls down. You learn to listen to the foundation. You notice when a door doesn't swing right, or when the floor starts to sag under a weight it wasn't designed to carry. I had been watching the cracks in my relationship with Julian for 5 years, ever since he started climbing the corporate ladder at the investment firm and met Diana Vance. At first, it was small things: a rescheduled dinner, a missed call. Julian was building his career in the glass towers of downtown Charlotte. I understood that. I had worked 6 days a week myself when I was starting out. But there was a difference between working hard and slipping away. Every time he visited, he looked more distant, talking about stock portfolios and golf clubs. He looked at my calloused hands, the hands that paid for his college tuition, with a strange kind of pity. He stopped asking about Miller & Sons projects. Then he married Diana. The Vances are old Charlotte money in Myers Park. Leonard Vance, a retired corporate attorney, speaks in condescending tones, measuring a person's worth by their status. Evelyn Vance measures people by their zip code. To them, I was just a contractor in work boots who drove a truck. Their politeness was like a sheet of thin ice over a deep pond. You knew if you stepped too hard, you would go under. Julian fit right into their world. He bought the house they recommended, joined the club Leonard suggested, and started speaking with the same quiet, bloodless confidence. He became a man who agreed with his wife's family before he even heard what they were saying, and I became the father he had to explain. The night of my birthday was the final crack in the wall. The phone call lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was enough to show me that the foundation was completely gone. I set the receiver down and stood there in the quiet kitchen. Earl, my gray tabby cat, rubbed against my ankle, letting out a soft, questioning meow. "Just us tonight, Earl," I said. I walked over to the stove and turned off the burner under the pot roast. I didn't eat any of it. I wrapped the meat in foil, put it in the refrigerator, and left the table set just the way it was. The 3 plates, the 3 chairs. I wanted to remember the shape of my son's absence. I went to the living room and sat in the dark. I wasn't angry. I was just done. When a building is beyond saving, you don't patch the drywall. You tear it down to the dirt and you start over. I started Miller & Sons in 1987. At the time, Dilworth wasn't the trendy neighborhood it is today. It was just a collection of craftsman bungalows and quiet streets lined with oak trees, where people left their front doors unlocked. I was 29 years old, and my entire net worth consisted of $400 in cash, a toolbox my father had given me when I graduated high school, and a 1978 Ford F-150 with a rusted tailgate and a passenger door that only opened if kicked from inside. But the most important thing I had was a name. I borrowed the Sons part of the company name from a future I hadn't even built yet. Julian wasn't born when I had the logo painted on the truck door. Helen thought it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. I remember the morning she saw the truck. We were living in a rented duplex on East Boulevard. Helen came onto the porch holding a mug of black coffee, looked at the fresh paint on the door, and laughed so hard she had to set her mug on the railing. "Gerald Miller," she said, her eyes bright with amusement. "You don't even have a son yet, and you're already putting him to work on the truck." "I'm planning ahead," I told her, wiping dust off the fender. "A family business needs a proper name. It shows people we intend to stay around." Helen shook her head, still smiling, and reached over to straighten the collar of my work shirt. It was a habit of hers, fixing things that didn't strictly need fixing, just because her hands needed something to do when she was happy. "You are the most stubborn, impossible man I have ever met," she said softly. "But I suppose that's why I married you." "I took that as a compliment," I said, and I still remember the warmth of her hand against my neck. That was in March. By October, Helen was 8 months pregnant, and the F-150 had accumulated another 10,000 miles of city driving. The first job under the Miller & Sons name was a bathroom renovation for a school teacher on Springdale Avenue. It was 4 days of grueling work, tearing out water-damaged plaster, replacing rotted joists, and laying white hexagonal tile by hand. I charged her $310 after the cost of materials. I came home on a Friday evening with the check in my shirt pocket. Helen was standing at the stove making chicken and rice, the duplex filled with the warm smell of dinner. I pulled the check out and held it up without saying a word. She turned around, looked at the numbers written in neat blue ink, and her eyes went bright and full all at once. She pressed her lips together tight, trying not to cry, and then failed completely, laughing at herself as she wiped her face with a checkered dish towel. "Gerald," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Miller & Sons," I said, my chest swelling with a pride that had nothing to do with the money. It was the first time I felt like I was actually building a foundation for the life we had promised each other. She walked over and wrapped her arms around my neck, the dish towel still in her hand. I held her tight, feeling the solid, round weight of our unborn child press between us. We stood in that small kitchen for a long time, the steam from the rice pot rising around us, and I swore to myself that I would never let her down. Julian was born 4 weeks later on a rainy Thursday morning at Presbyterian Hospital, When the nurse handed him to me in the delivery room, my hands were shaking. These rough hands that spent 10 hours a day lifting oak beams, pouring concrete, and swinging hammers in July heat were trembling so hard I was terrified of dropping him. He was so small. That's the thing they never prepare you for when you have your first child. How incredibly fragile a baby actually is. He looked like he was made of paper and glass. I looked at his tiny face, his fists curled tight near his chin, and I felt a sudden, fierce certainty that went straight to my bones. I looked at my son and thought, I would burn this whole city to the ground before I let anything harm you. Helen watched me from the hospital bed, her face pale and exhausted, but her eyes full of a soft, knowing light. Gerald, she said gently, you're vibrating. Sit down before you drop him. I'm not shaking, I said, my voice thick and strange. Yes, you are, she laughed softly. Your whole body is shaking. Sit. I sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, cradling Julian against my chest. I built the company for him, I whispered to her. Before he was even here, I built it for him. I know, Helen said, reaching out to touch my arm. He'll know that too someday. She was right about most things in our life, but that was one promise that didn't turn out the way we hoped. In the years that followed, the days blurred into a long cycle of work. Miller & Sons grew from simple renovations to full residential additions. And by the late 1990s, we were taking on commercial contracts. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 14 hours a day. I was up before the sun, loading the truck in the dark, and I came home long after Julian had gone to bed, my clothes covered in drywall dust and the smell of cedar wood. I missed things, I won't pretend I didn't. I missed his 4th grade school play because a concrete pour in Dilworth went 3 hours over schedule. I missed his Little League games, except for one Saturday when I managed to slip away from a framing job in Myers Park to catch the last 2 innings. I remember parking the truck on the grass behind the outfield fence. When Julian spotted me in the stands, his face lit up. He stood a little straighter. At second base, his glove held high. That look on his face cost me more than any commercial contract I ever signed, but it was the only currency that mattered. After the game, he ran over, his cap pushed sideways, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Dad, did you see that play? Did you see me catch it? I saw it, son, I lied. I had missed the actual catch while talking to a subcontractor on my cell phone, but I had seen the way his face looked when he saw me standing there. You did great. He grabbed my calloused hand, his small fingers barely wrapping around 3 of mine, and pulled me toward the concession stand, talking a mile a minute. I let him pull me. I looked down at him and thought about the name on the side of the F-150. Everything I was doing, every hour of sweat, every argument with inspectors, every dollar saved, was for the boy holding my hand. The years that followed were the kind that make for a good life, even if they don't make for high drama. Miller & Sons grew steadily. By 1995, we shifted from renovations to commercial contracts. We hired our first full-time crew in 1991, and by 2005, we had 12 people on the payroll managing properties all over Charlotte. I had gone from driving a beat-up Ford with a rusted tailgate to owning a fleet of 4 clean white trucks with the family name painted on the side in blue lettering. But as the business grew, my time at home shrunk. I was always chasing the next contract, estimating bids, or solving crises on job sites. Helen managed the house, the bills, and Julian's school schedule. She was the one who helped him with algebra homework and drove him to practice. I was the one who signed the checks and showed up, late, smelling of lumber and concrete. I remember when Julian was 17, and he got his acceptance letter from the University of North Carolina. I sold a renovated bungalow on Tremont Avenue to pay his college tuition deposit. Helen and I sat at the kitchen table. One evening, the signed property transfer documents sitting between us next to our coffee mugs. She looked at the papers, then looked at me with that gentle, searching expression she used when she knew I was hiding something behind my practical exterior. You didn't have to sell the Tremont house, Gerald, she said softly, placing her hand over mine. We could have taken a loan. That house was your pet project. I wanted it paid in full, Helen, I told her. No debts hanging over him. He needs to start his adult life with a clean slate. She studied my face for a long time. her thumb lightly rubbing the back of my calloused knuckles. "You know he loves you, don't you?" she asked. "He doesn't need a college fund or a house to know that. He just needs his father to show up." "I show up," I said, my jaw tightening slightly. "I'm here." "I know you do, Gerald," she said, her voice dropping. "You're a good provider. You've worked yourself to the bone for us. But the company, the properties, they aren't the whole of you. Don't let them be. Don't let the work eat you alive." I squeezed her hand. "As long as I have you to keep my feet on the ground, I'll be fine." She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that had kept me steady through every bad economy and difficult client for 3 decades. "Well," she said, "I plan to be around for a long time." But she was wrong. Helen's health started failing in 2020. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It arrived slowly, the way a house settles on its foundation over a long winter. You don't notice the damage until a door refuses to close right, or a window starts to stick in the frame. At first, it was just fatigue, a slight shortness of breath when she walked up the stairs, and a quiet cough she tried to hide from me. By the summer of 2021, she was spending her days in a bed at Presbyterian Hospital. I turned the daily operations of Miller and Sons over to my senior foreman, Leon, and spent every day in the hospital. I arrived at 7 in the morning, bringing her the newspaper so she could do the crossword puzzle, and stayed until the nurses kicked me out. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her bed, drinking terrible coffee from the machine. And we talked, even in that sterile room, with monitors beeping and tubes connected to her wrist. Helen was entirely herself. She complained about the quality of the hospital jello, the temperature of the room, and the loud television in the next ward. On a Tuesday morning in October, about 2 weeks before the end, she asked me to pull my chair closer. Her voice had gone thin and raspy, but her eyes were still sharp and clear. "Gary," she whispered, using the nickname she reserved for serious moments. "I need you to promise me something." I took her hand. It felt light and dry like a fallen leaf. "Anything, Helen. You name it. You're going to worry about Julian," she said, drawing a slow, shallow breath. "You'll want to put him first, the way you've always done. You'll want to build a safety net under him so he never has to feel the ground. But Jerry, you have to promise me you won't disappear into it. Don't make yourself so small that there's nothing left of you when you finally need yourself." My throat felt tight as if I had swallowed a stone. I pressed her hand to my lips. "I'll take care of him, Helen, I promise." "No," she said, her grip surprisingly firm. "Promise me you'll take care of Julian, but promise me you'll take care of you too. You have a life, Jerry. Don't let it end when mine does." "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking. She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face. Then she let out a soft sigh. "Good. Now go get me that newspaper. Today's puzzle is supposed to be a hard one." Helen passed away 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:12. I was holding her hand when her breathing simply stopped. I drove back to our house in Dilworth alone that evening. The October light was gold and sideways through the oak trees, and the neighborhood looked beautiful in a way that felt entirely unfair. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to open the car door. When I finally walked inside, the silence of the house hit me like a physical blow. The rooms weren't empty. They were full of 34 years of Helen. Her reading glasses were still sitting on the side table. Her favorite coffee mug, the one with the blue flowers in the chipped rim, was in the sink. Her handwriting was everywhere, written on the recipe cards in the kitchen drawer. The house was full of her, but she was gone. Julian and Diana came down from their place that night. Julian hugged me in the hallway, clinging to me the way he had when he was a little boy. I felt his shoulders shaking, and for a moment I thought that even if the worst had happened, we still had each other. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I know." "Son," I told him, rubbing his back, "I know." Diana stood a few feet behind him, composed and neat, expressing sympathy with the polite distance of a bank teller handling a deposit. "Jerry," she said, "let us know if you need anything." They stayed for 3 days to help with the funeral, and then they went back to their life in Myers Park. And the house in Dilworth became very quiet. That first year after Helen passed, Julian called every Sunday, regular as weather. We would talk for 20 or 30 minutes about the properties we were managing, his investment portfolios, and small things that didn't matter much but kept the line open. I lived for those Sunday calls more than I ever let him know. I would sit by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee waiting for the phone to light up. But by the second year, the Sunday calls became every other Sunday, then once a month. I told myself he was busy. He was building his career, his life with Diana, and climbing the social ladder in Myers Park. I understood the momentum a man in his mid-30s needs to maintain. I didn't want to be a burden. It was around that time that I properly met my neighbor, Alice Weaver. Alice had lived next door for 11 years, but we had never exchanged more than quick waves over the cedar fence and the occasional borrowed lawnmower. Her husband had passed away 2 years before Helen. She was 65, sharp-tongued in the kindest possible way, and she had a habit of appearing at my door on Saturday mornings with 2 mugs of hot coffee already made, as if she had simply decided we were going to be friends and was giving me no say in the matter. The first time she did it was a damp morning in November. I opened the door and she held out a heavy blue mug. "You look like you haven't talked to another human being in 4 days, Gerald," she said, her voice brisk and no nonsense. "3, I said, taking the mug. "Close enough." "Sit," she said, nodding toward the 2 wooden chairs on the front porch. "I'm not going anywhere for at least an hour." I sat, and for the first time since the funeral, I talked to someone who wasn't a client, subcontractor, or my son. Alice didn't have an agenda. She didn't look at me with that heavy, suffocating pity people reserve for widowers. She just wanted to know how I was doing, and she stayed to listen. One morning, about 6 months into our coffee routine, Alice looked at me sideways over her mug. "Gerald, are you lonely?" she asked. I turned the question over, watching a blue jay land on the bird feeder between our yards before flying away. "Loneliness is a choice, Alice," I said finally. "So is everything else." She raised an eyebrow. "That's either very wise or very stubborn. With you, I genuinely cannot tell which." "Probably both," I said. She laughed, a real hearty laugh that came from her chest, and the sound of it hit me somewhere unexpected. It wasn't grief, but the sudden, sharp ache of realizing that laughter had been absent from my mornings for longer than I had noticed. By the autumn of 2024, Julian and Diana's visits had become so rare that I had stopped expecting them. A birthday card in January, a quick text on Thanksgiving, dinner maybe twice a year if the calendar cooperated and they had a free evening between their charity galas. I had adjusted to this new distance the way a man adjusts to a bad knee. You stop waiting for it to feel normal, and you just account for it in every step you take. I wasn't angry. I was just realistic. But something had started shifting quietly in my mind. Like that door that refused to close right, I began to realize that the foundation of my relationship with my son was dry rotting. I just hadn't figured out how deep the rot went until December arrived, bringing the cold winter air and the holidays. I had almost convinced myself that Christmas at the Vances' mansion would be fine. I had told myself I could walk into their home in Myers Park, put on a smile, make pleasant talk, and be the kind of guest people were glad to have in the room. I had almost convinced myself that the distance between us was just my own imagination. Julian called me on December 21st to confirm I was coming. "Leonard and Evelyn are looking forward to seeing you, Dad," he said, his voice smooth and professional, the tone he used for clients at the firm. "Diana's been planning the menu all week. It's going to be a good time, really." "I'll be there, Julian," I said. I found out later, through a source I'll get to in time, that Evelyn Vance had said something quite different the week before when Julian first mentioned my name, but I didn't know that on December 21st. I just knew I had given my word to my son, and a miller doesn't go back on his word. I wore the navy blue wool jacket Julian had given me for Christmas the year before. It was an expensive jacket, well-made and heavy, the kind of thing I would never buy for myself, but immediately recognized as quality the moment I put it on. I had worn it exactly twice since he gave it to me. I wanted him to see me in it. I wanted him to know I valued his gift. The Vances lived in Myers Park, a neighborhood where the houses sit back from the street behind old, sweeping willow oaks. The lawns are manicured by professional crews, and the whole area has the particular, heavy stillness of a place where wealth has been sitting long enough to get comfortable. I had built 2 commercial offices near that neighborhood in the 1990s. I knew the streets well. I had just never driven them on a cold December evening as a guest. Their house was a massive brick colonial with white columns and a wraparound porch strung with warm white lights. Every window glowed from within, looking like a high-end Christmas card. I arrived at 6:45. Dinner was scheduled for 7 Life. I parked my truck on the street because the driveway was already full of luxury cars, and I didn't want to block anyone in. I walked up the stone path, my breath fogging in the cold air, and reached out toward the heavy wooden door. But before my hand could touch the brass knocker, I stopped. The door wasn't fully closed. There was a small gap, maybe a half-inch, where the latch hadn't caught properly. Through that gap, I could hear voices carrying clearly into the quiet evening. Through the half-inch gap in the heavy wooden door, the voices carried clearly into the cold December night. It was Evelyn Vance's voice first. She had that warm, polished Southern inflection that makes even the most pointed insults sound like pleasantries, a social skill she had spent a lifetime perfecting. "I just hope he doesn't make it into a whole production again, the way he did at Thanksgiving," she said, the clink of a glass following her words. Julian married well despite his background, and I respect that, I really do. But that father of his, Gerald, I worry he's going to become a fixture we simply cannot remove. He has no idea how to read a room, and he gets so defensive about that little construction business, as if anyone in our circle is impressed. There was a brief pause, the sound of ice shifting in a glass, and then Leonard Vance's voice, lower and agreeable, the tone of a man who had made a long career out of agreeing with his wife. "He means well, Evelyn," Leonard said. "Meaning well doesn't change the embarrassment, Leonard," Evelyn replied, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she moved across the room. "Diana doesn't say anything because she is gracious, but I can see the strain on her face every time Gerald starts in about drywall or concrete pours. It's embarrassing for Julian, especially at the firm. At some point, Julian is going to have to make a choice about where his priorities lie. He has a real partnership ahead of him. He doesn't need that weight around his ankle." I stood on the front porch of the Vance mansion in Myers Park. Wearing the navy blue wool jacket my son had given me for Christmas the year before, and I listened to my daughter-in-law's mother call me a weight around his ankle. My hand was still raised toward the brass knocker. I lowered it slowly. I want you to understand something about that moment. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel the hot, stinging rush of humiliation or the sudden surge of anger that makes your hands shake. What I felt was something much colder, much cleaner, I felt certain. For 2 years, I had suspected that this was the water Julian and Diana swam in. I had sensed the unspoken agreements in their home, the quiet condescension that hung over their dinner table whenever I visited. I had felt it, but I had refused to confirm it. A father doesn't want to admit that his son is ashamed of him. You make excuses. You tell yourself you're being overly sensitive, that they're just busy, that they come from a different world. But standing on that porch, the excuses dissolved. Now I knew the truth. I stood there for 10 seconds, letting the cold air clear my head. I adjusted the collar of the navy jacket, ensuring the top button was secure. Then I raised my hand again and pressed the doorbell. The door opened 30 seconds later. Evelyn Vance stood in the warm light of the foyer, wearing a dark green silk dress, her silver hair styled perfectly. The moment her eyes met mine, a warm, radiant smile appeared on her face, arranged with the precision of a woman who had been welcoming company for decades. "Gerald," she said, her voice dripping with hospitality. "You made it. Come in, come in. It is absolutely freezing out there." "Evelyn," I said, stepping inside the high-ceilinged foyer and shaking her hand. My grip was firm and brief. "Merry Christmas. You have a beautiful home. The lights on the lawn are spectacular." "Oh, Leonard picked them out," she said, touching my arm lightly as she stepped back to let me close the door. "He has a real eye for that sort of thing." Leonard appeared from the living room holding a glass of scotch. He was a tall, broad man with silver hair and the comfortable ease of someone who had never once had to wonder whether he belonged in the room he was standing in. Gerald, good to see you, Leonard said, extending his hand. Good to see you. Leonard, I said. Julian came around the corner a moment later, and the sight of him, my son, 38 years old, wearing a tailored button-down shirt and looking completely at home in this massive house that was not his, hit me somewhere below the ribs. He crossed the wood-paneled foyer and clapped me on the shoulder, his grip warm and familiar. Dad, you look great, he said, his eyes tracking down to the jacket. A brief, pleased smile touched his lips. Hey, you wore it. Of course I wore it, son, I said, looking into his eyes. It's a good jacket. Keeps the wind out. I'm glad, he said, his smile genuine for a second. It was the smile he used to have when we were working on the Ford truck in the driveway before he started talking about market trends and investment portfolios. For a brief moment, standing in that warm hallway with the smell of pine needles and expensive candles in the air, I felt a flicker of hope. I told myself that maybe the conversation I had overheard was just the in-laws' venom. Maybe my son was still the boy I had raised. Then Diana appeared at the top of the stairs, elegant and composed in a cream-colored dress. She walked down the steps with a slow, practiced grace, her eyes landing on me. Gary, she said, offering a polite smile. We're so glad you could make it. Dinner is just about ready. Diana, I said. Merry Christmas. Behind her came Evelyn, who looked at me and smiled so perfectly that you would have needed to be standing on her front porch 2 minutes earlier to know exactly what that smile was worth. I smiled right back. I had come to Myers Park tonight to find out one thing: what my son would do when it mattered. The dinner table was where I would get my answer. Dinner at the Vanceys was served at 7 sharp, which told you everything you needed to know about how Evelyn ran her household. The dining room was long and formal, dominated by a dark mahogany table set for 8 people. Crystal wine glasses caught the candlelight, and a centerpiece of white poinsettias and fresh pine nettles occupied the middle of the table. Everything was beautiful, arranged, and completely sterile. I took my seat near the end of the table, across from Leonard, and unfolded my linen napkin with the care of a man who was paying close attention to everything happening around him. Diana sat on my left and Julian was across from her. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. She lifted her wine glass, her diamond rings catching the light, and smiled down the length of the table. Family, she said warmly, her voice smooth as silk. What a blessing! We are so glad to have everyone here tonight. Everyone murmured in agreement. I raised my water glass. I don't drink at other people's tables, never have, and I smiled back. The first jab arrived about 20 minutes into the meal, wrapped so perfectly in pleasantry that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. Gerald, Evelyn said, reaching for the bread basket. Julian tells us Miller & Sons is still going strong. Those small residential renovations, there's always such a steady market for that in Charlotte, isn't there? People are always needing a bathroom tiled or a deck repaired. I set my fork down slowly. We actually moved into commercial property management about 15 years ago, Evelyn, I said, keeping my voice easy and conversational. We currently manage 43 commercial properties in the Charlotte area and have 12 people on the payroll. We haven't done residential renovations since 2008. Oh, of course, Evelyn waved a gracious hand as if the distinction were a charming detail rather than a complete correction. I always mix up the different kinds of construction work. Leonard, you know more about that. Didn't your college roommate do something in development? Leonard launched into a long story about his college roommate. Evelyn had pivoted so smoothly that the other guests at the table probably thought she had paid me a compliment. I glanced at Julian. He was cutting his chicken. He had heard every word. He did not look up. I noted that, filed it away, and kept eating. The second jab came 10 minutes later when the conversation turned to retirement. Specifically, Leonard's golf schedule and a couple their age who had just sold their home and moved into a smaller condo in Florida. There's something so freeing about letting go of the big responsibilities, Evelyn said, addressing the table generally, though I could feel the sharp angle of her attention. Stepping back, giving the next generation room to grow, without the older generation hovering. At a certain point, holding on just becomes a burden to everyone. She smiled at me as she said that last word. I find I'm not much of a hoverer, Evelyn, I said, offering a pleasant smile. I've never had the patience for it. Leonard let out a short chuckle, and someone else at the table laughed lightly. Evelyn tilted her head, her expression one of affectionate amusement, the kind reserved for people whose simple jokes you were tolerating. I looked at Julian again. He was reaching for his wine glass, his eyes tracking left, then right, looking anywhere but in my direction. My chest felt tight, a slow, painful contraction that I refused to let show on my face. The boy I had held in the delivery room, the one whose Little League games I had rushed to see. He was sitting 8 feet away from me, and he was choosing, methodically and deliberately, not to see me. The final jab arrived with dessert. Evelyn was telling a story about a friend's daughter who had finally convinced her elderly father to sell his insurance business so he could enjoy his remaining years. It takes a certain kind of self-awareness, Evelyn said, her eyes locking onto mine. The look lasted exactly long enough to be unmistakable to anyone watching, and short enough to be denied if called out, to recognize when holding on becomes a burden to the people you love most. Don't you think, Gerald? The table went quiet. The other guests waited, some curious, some uncomfortable. I felt Diana's sudden stillness on my left, the particular quality of a woman holding on to a very practiced composure, and more than anything, I felt the weight of Julian's silence. I looked at Evelyn Vance, and I smiled with the warmth of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove. I think the people who love you most, Evelyn, I said, are usually the last ones to call you a burden. A brief beat of absolute silence hung in the room. Then Leonard cleared his throat loudly, making a comment about the chocolate cake, and the moment dissolved the way those moments do. It was covered over, but the air pressure in the room had shifted. I looked at my son one final time. Julian's jaw was tight, his teeth clenched so hard the muscles in his cheeks stood out. His hand around his fork was rigid, his knuckles white. He had heard every exchange. He had understood the insults, and he had sat there, absorbed it all, and said absolutely nothing. He hadn't defended me. He hadn't deflected. He hadn't even acknowledged the tension. That was the answer I had come to Myers Park to find. After dessert, the guests drifted into the living room. I stayed for another 40 minutes, just enough to be polite, before making my excuses. I shook Leonard's hand, thanked Evelyn for the dinner, and meant none of it. She knew I meant none of it, but we both smiled anyway, honoring the social contract of people who dislike each other in public. Julian walked me to the front door. The hallway was quiet, the sound of laughter from the living room muted.
Good to have you, Dad,
Julian said, his voice flat. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a man who had been performing for too many people for too long. I looked at my son's face, searching for any trace of the boy who used to run to my truck. Take care of yourself, Julian, I said softly. I gave him a brief hug, feeling his arms come around my back for a second, and then I turned and walked out into the cold December night. I drove away from Myers Park in silence, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel. I wasn't rushing. I took the long way back to Dilworth, passing through the neighborhoods where I had spent the last 4 decades building. I passed the commercial complex on Moorhead Street that Miller and Sons had framed back in 1994. The building was dark, but its brick columns stood solid and straight in the streetlights, a testament to honest labor. I arrived home at 10:40. The duplex was exactly as I had left it. The kitchen light was on, throwing a warm rectangle onto the gravel driveway. The house had the particular stillness of a place that had learned to accommodate only one person. I hung the navy wool jacket on the peg by the door. I stood there for a moment, my hand lingering on the wool, which was still cold from the night air. I thought about Julian's face when he saw me wearing it. "Hey, you wore it!" I walked into the kitchen. Earl, my gray tabby, appeared from the living room, weaving between my ankles and purring loudly. He had belonged to Helen, but after she passed, he had transferred his loyalty to me with the pragmatic ease of a creature who understands who controls the food supply. "Tough night, Earl," I whispered, reaching down to scratch him behind the ears. Earl offered no commentary, which was exactly what I needed. I made a cup of decaf coffee and sat at the table. On the wall beside the refrigerator hung the calendar Helen had put up before she went to the hospital. She had a habit of circling important family dates in red ink. Birthdays, doctor visits, the date we finished our first commercial project. January 19th was circled in red. Next to it, in her small, neat handwriting, she had drawn a tiny heart. I stared at that heart for a long time. Then I picked up the kitchen phone and dialed Walter Davis. Walter and I went back 40 years. We met on a framing crew in 1984, back when we were both young, broke, and convinced we knew everything about the construction business. Walter was a man of almost supernatural calm, whereas I was loud, impatient, and full of opinions. We should have hated each other. Instead, we became the kind of friends you only make when you are young enough to be completely honest. He left construction in 1991 to attend seminary, a decision I teased him about for a year before admitting privately that it was exactly the right path for him. He had been the pastor of a small Baptist church in Charlotte for over 20 years now. He spent his days counseling his congregation, and he answered his phone at 11 on a holiday eve without a trace of irritation. He picked up on the second ring. "Gerald, it's late. Is everything all right?" "I need to get my affairs in order, Walter," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "My legal affairs, the will, the trust, the properties. I've been putting it off." There was a pause on the line. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the quiet of a man who understood the weight of what I was saying and was choosing his next words with care. "How serious is this, Jerry?" Walter asked. "Serious enough that I wanted you to know before I did anything," I said. I heard the creak of his leather chair. I had sat in his church office 100 times, drinking bad coffee and talking about the things you don't say to anyone else. "Does this have to do with Julian?" he asked. I looked at the calendar on the wall, at the red circle, and the small heart Helen had drawn. "It has to do with everything, Walter," I said, my voice steady. "I've been watching this crawl forward for 2 years. Tonight, at the Vance's table, I finally got the clarity I was waiting for. I need a good attorney. Someone who doesn't flinch at complicated family structures. Brenda Stone," Walter said immediately. "She's thorough. She handles estate planning for several of our church members. I'll give you her number." "Thank you, Walter." "Gary." His voice shifted, becoming softer, the tone he used when he was speaking as a pastor rather than a friend. "Whatever has happened, you know where I stand. I won't lie to Julian if he comes to me asking questions." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm calling you. I don't want him lied to. I just want him to hear the truth from someone who isn't bleeding from the same wound." Walter let out a slow breath. "Call me when you're ready to move forward. I'll help you do it right." "Good night, Walter." I hung up. Earl had jumped onto the table and was sitting in the middle of it, watching me with his green eyes. I left him there, rinsed my mug, and went to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the framed photo on the nightstand. Helen and me, 1987, standing in front of our duplex on East Boulevard. She was laughing, her head tilted back. "I have to do this, Helen," I whispered to the glass. "I promised you I'd take care of myself, too. I think this is what you meant." The photograph didn't answer, but the silence in the room felt like an agreement. Christmas morning came at 6:15. I made coffee and watched the frost on the lawn. At 9:03, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Julian. "Merry Christmas, Dad." I stared at those 3 words. I thought about all the words that weren't there, all the things that had been left unsaid at the dinner table the night before. I typed back, "You too, son." Then I laid the phone face down on the counter, poured my coffee, and began planning for January. I had exactly 3 weeks. I called Brenda Stone on the morning of January 6th at 8:15, before the rest of the business world had finished their first cup of coffee. Walter had been right about her. She was 54 years old, methodical to the point of being almost clinical, and she possessed the dry, unflappable composure of a lawyer who had seen enough family conflict to be entirely unsurprised by anything humans did to each other. She answered on the second ring. "Brenda Stone." "Brenda, this is Gerald Miller. Walter Davis gave me your number. I need to schedule a meeting this week if you have the time." A brief pause, the sound of a keyboard tapping. "Tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. My office is on Trade Street. I'll be there, I said. I arrived at her office on the 14th floor of a brick building overlooking downtown Charlotte, carrying a yellow legal pad. Written on it in black ink were 8 numbered items, each one clear and specific, written in the same style I used for construction specifications at Miller & Sons. No emotions, no dramatic explanations, just pure technical requirements. Brenda read the list for a full minute, her face entirely neutral. She adjusted her reading glasses, set the pad on her desk, and looked up at me. "How long have you been thinking about this, Gerald?" she asked. 2 years for some of it, I told her. 2 weeks for the rest. She looked down at the pad again. The corporate restructuring of Miller & Sons Property Management LLC that was completed in October 2022. "Yes," I said. "And your son, Julian, was never added as a member or manager during that restructuring." "He was not," I said. Brenda leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers laced together. "Tell me why, Gerald. Not because it changes the legal work, but because I need to know what kind of structural integrity we are dealing with here." I stared at a framed print of the Charlotte skyline on her wall. Julian and Diana's wedding reception was in October 2022. It was held at a country club in Myers Park. I was standing near the bar, waiting for a glass of water, and I heard Leonard Vance, Diana's father, talking to a group of his golf friends. Men in expensive suits, talking about money the way other men talk about the weather. My voice was flat, carrying no anger, just the facts. Leonard said, and I remember his exact words. "Julian married into our circle well. That construction inheritance of his should set them up nicely. He called my life's work an inheritance before my wife was even in the ground a full year. And Julian was standing right next to him. He didn't correct his father-in-law. He just smiled, took a sip of his drink, and nodded. Brenda's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "You restructured the company the following week," she noted. "I did," I said. "I removed Julian from any potential succession path. I changed the company charter to ensure that upon my death or retirement, the ownership of Miller & Sons transfers directly to a charitable foundation supporting elderly housing in Charlotte. The company is currently structured as a member-managed LLC, and I am the sole member. Julian has zero legal claim to it." "And he doesn't know?" "He never asked," I said. "He assumed the name Miller & Sons was a legal guarantee. He thought because he was my son, the business was his by right of birth. He didn't realize that in business, as in life, nothing is guaranteed unless it's signed on a dotted line." Brenda nodded slowly, accepting the logic without judgment. "And the remaining items on this list? The personal estate? The house?" "I want the duplex in Dilworth sold," I said. "I've already spoken with Gary Porter, my realtor. He has a buyer lined up who is willing to purchase the property off-market, cash, with a quick closing. The proceeds from the sale, along with all my personal bank accounts, will be moved into an irrevocable spendthrift trust. Under North Carolina General Statutes Section 36C5501, Brenda murmured, her pen scratching against a notepad. "An irrevocable trust with a spendthrift provision. Who is the beneficiary?" "My unborn grandchild," I said. "Diana is pregnant, due in September. The trust will be held for the child, accessible only when they turn 18 and only for educational or medical expenses. Neither Julian nor Diana will have any access or control over the funds. I want you and Walter Davis to act as co-trustees." Brenda looked at me over her glasses. "This completely cuts Julian out of your personal estate. He will receive nothing. Not the house, not the cash, not the business." "He told me I had 2 choices," I said, remembering the cold kitchen and the untouched cake. "He said I could apologize to the Vances or figure out how to live alone. He wanted to see if I would bend. I am choosing a third option." Brenda sat in silence for a moment, her eyes tracking the list on the yellow pad. "It's clean, Gerald," she said finally. "The corporate structure is already secure. The sale of the house is a private transaction. The trust is perfectly legal under North Carolina law, and because it is irrevocable, it cannot be challenged by Julian or the Vances after you are gone. We can have the documents drafted by next week." "Do it," I said. I stood up and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, and entirely free of pity. "Take care of yourself, Gerald," she said. "I intend to," I said. I walked out of the building on Trade Street and into the January sunshine. The air was crisp, and the sky was a pale, clear blue. I felt light. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of the future wasn't pressing down on my shoulders. I had a plan, and I was going to execute it with the same precision I had used to build every wall in this city. The legal mechanism of my departure had to be flawless. When you are dismantling a lifetime of work, you don't use a sledgehammer. You use a scalpel. You make sure every cut is clean, every joint is sealed, and every document is filed in the proper court, so there is no leverage for anyone to rebuild what you have taken down. Over the next 10 days, Brenda Stone worked with the quiet efficiency of a master craftsman. We met twice more in her office in Trade Street, signing stacks of paperwork that would systematically redirect every dollar I had earned. The first step was the restructuring of Miller & Sons Property Management, LLC. The company was my pride, the name on the truck doors that I had painted in 1987. I remembered the smell of the wet paint that morning, the way Helen had laughed, and the dreams we had spoken aloud. But a company is just a shell. The value lies in the operating agreements. Because I had structured it as a member-managed LLC with myself as the sole member, I held 100% of the voting rights and equity. Julian had never been an employee, officer, or partner. He had only been a spectator waiting for the curtain to fall so he could collect the box office receipts. I executed a transfer of membership interest. Under North Carolina corporate law, I signed an amendment stating that, upon my resignation as manager or my death, my entire membership interest would transfer automatically to * the Golden Years Sanctuaries, a registered 501(c)(3) nonprofit under * NCGS Chapter 55A that built and operated affordable housing for elderly, low-income fathers in the Charlotte area. I chose this charity deliberately. It was a place that helped men who had spent their lives working, only to find themselves abandoned or forgotten by their families in their final years. It felt fitting that the fruits of my labor would protect fathers who shared my silence. I also resigned as the active manager of the LLC, effective February 1st. I appointed a professional property management board to run the day-to-day operations, ensuring that the 12 people on my payroll kept their jobs and the 43 commercial properties remained under stable management. The board would pay me a modest monthly pension from the company's operating revenues, just enough to cover my living expenses in Maine. The rest of the profits would go directly to the sanctuary. Julian's name was never mentioned in the documents. He was legally bypassed. The second step was the creation of the * Helen Miller Memorial Trust under * NCGS Section 36C5501. Brenda drafted an irrevocable spendthrift trust. A spendthrift trust is a specific legal structure designed to protect assets. Because the trust is irrevocable, the assets no longer belong to me, they belong to the trust. Because of the spendthrift provision, the beneficiary has no power to transfer their interest, and creditors cannot touch the principal. The beneficiary of this trust was Julian's unborn child, due in September. I transferred my personal investment accounts, which had accumulated over decades of careful saving, directly into the trust's registry. I appointed Walter Davis and Brenda Stone as co-trustees. They held the keys. Julian and Diana would have no voice in how the funds were managed, nor would they receive a single dime. The trust agreement was clear. The money was to be held until the child turned 18 and could only be disbursed by the co-trustees for documented educational expenses at accredited institutions or emergency medical care. Neither Julian's investment firm nor Diana's family attorneys could touch it. It was a fortress. They will look for loopholes, Gerald. Brenda had warned me, looking over her reading glasses as I signed the final page of the trust agreement. Leonard Vance is a corporate attorney. He will dissect these documents looking for a way in. Let him try, I said. I built this business from the dirt. I know how to build a structure that doesn't collapse under wind. He won't find one, she replied. Since you are the sole member and owner of the assets, you have the absolute legal right to distribute them as you see fit. There is no marital claim and no filial inheritance right in North Carolina that can override a valid, irrevocable trust. I left a separate letter with Brenda, sealed in a white envelope addressed to Diana, not to Julian. In that envelope, I placed a copy of the trust agreement and a brief note. "I never blamed you for the silence, Diana," I wrote. "But the man you are living with is not the son I raised. I hope one day he finds his way back to himself. When he does, I hope you are still there. Until then, this is for the child you are carrying. He shares my blood, and he deserves a foundation that isn't built on shame." The third step was the liquid assets. I closed my personal accounts at Bank of America, leaving only a small operating account with $5, selling to cover my final utility bills and travel expenses. The rest of my cash, $240,000, was wired directly into the trust account. I knew what Julian and the Vances had been planning. Julian had recently been promoted to a junior partner track at his firm, a promotion that was heavily greased by Leonard Vance's social connections. But a partnership track in Myers Park requires buy-in. It requires a show of capital. I knew from a mutual acquaintance at the country club that Julian had already committed to a $150,000 investment in a new commercial real estate fund the firm was launching in February. He was planning to use his share of the construction business as collateral for the bank loan, or simply ask me for a distribution from Miller & Sons cash reserves. He had told Leonard the money was as good as in the bank. He had no idea that the bank vault was already empty. On January 15th, Brenda Stone called me. "Everything is recorded, Gerald. The trust is active. The LLC amendments are filed with the Secretary of State, and the capital transfers are complete. Legally, you own nothing but your truck, your tools, and your clothes." "That's all I started with, Brenda," I told her. "It's more than enough." I hung up and stood in my quiet kitchen. The table was empty, the birthday plates put away in the cupboard. Earl sat on the windowsill, watching the winter rain hit the glass. I felt a quiet, immovable peace settling into my chest. The walls were up, the roof was shingled, and the locks were secure. Now, all that remained was the house itself. Selling the house was the most tangible part of the dissolution. You can change LLC charters and wire money in silence. But a house requires physical movement. It requires packers, boxes, and a sign on the dotted line. I called Gary Porter 2 days after my meeting with Brenda. Gary had been my real estate agent for 15 years, a quiet, discreet man who understood that in Dilworth, the best transactions happen without a sign in the yard. "Gary, I want to sell the duplex," I said when he picked up. "Off-market, private sale, cash buyer, quick closing. I don't want a listing, and I don't want open houses." "I have a buyer, Gerald," Gary said, his voice measured. "A family named Henderson. They've been looking for a craftsman duplex in Dilworth for 6 months. They have cash, and they're willing to waive the inspection if we can close by early February." "Set it up," I said, closing on February 7th. Over the next week, the packing began. I didn't have much to move. The company tools were already transferred to Leon and the foreman. The office furniture belonged to the LLC. Most of the household furniture was old, bought with Helen when we were young, and I decided to leave it for the Hendersons. They had young children, and Gary said they appreciated the vintage look of the solid oak dining table and the wooden chairs. I packed only what would fit into my old canvas duffel bag: 2 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, Helen's Bible with the broken spine, and the photograph of the 2 of us at Radnor Lake from 1987. I took Helen's old winter coats and her clothes down to the church shelter, donating them quietly to the clothing drive Walter was running. It felt right that her warmth would go to someone who needed it. Alice Weaver watched the activity from her kitchen window. On a Saturday morning, 2 days before my 68th birthday, she came over the cedar fence holding 2 mugs of coffee, her winter coat zipped to her chin. "You're packing," she said, handing me a mug as we sat on the porch step. The air was a crisp 38 degrees, and our breath made small white clouds. "I am," I said. "Where?" "Maine," I said. "A small cottage in Kennebunkport. Rented it from a retired schoolteacher named Abigail. Just for a few months to start. I want a place where the water is cold and the people are quiet, Alice. A place where nobody knows my name or expects me to build something for them." Alice stared out at the yard, where a cardinal was perched on the fence post, a bright splash of red against the gray January sky. She didn't ask why. She didn't lecture me about Julian. She had lived next door long enough to know when a structure was being dismantled, and she knew there was no point in arguing with the builder. "When is your birthday, Gerald?" she asked quietly. "Monday," I said. "January 19th. Are you cooking?" "Yes," I said. "Pot roast. Helen's recipe." Alice's face softened, a gentle, sad expression. "It's a good recipe. The best one I know," I said. We sat in silence, drinking our coffee. I thought about the previous year's birthday. Julian had called me at 4 in the afternoon to cancel our dinner. He said Diana's mother had organized a last-minute charity dinner at the country club, and they needed to be there. I had the pot roast in the oven and the table set for 2. I had sat in the quiet kitchen for an hour before Alice knocked on the door. She had seen Julian's car not show up. She came in carrying a terrible bottle of cheap Merlot and a box of bakery cookies. She had sat at my table, eaten the pot roast, and sang happy birthday so off-key that I had laughed until my chest ached. It was the first time I had laughed since Helen's funeral. "I remember that Merlot," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "It tasted like vinegar." "It was on sale," Alice laughed, her chest moving. "And my singing wasn't much better." "It was awful," I agreed. "But you laughed, Gerald," she said, looking at me, her eyes serious. "You laughed. Don't forget that part." "I won't," I said. On Monday morning, Gary Porter called to confirm the contract. The Hendersons had signed the purchase agreement at 10:30. The sale was legally binding. The closing was locked for February 7th, and the funds would be wired directly into the trust account Brenda had set up. "It's done, Gerald," Gary said. "The keys will be handed over on the 7th. I'll handle the walkthrough myself." "Thank you, Gary," I said. I hung up and stood in the empty living room. The boxes were stacked by the door. The calendar on the wall was still there, the red circle around today's date, January 19th. The table was set for 3. I had bought the cake from the bakery, and the pot roast was simmering on the stove, filling the house with the scent of garlic, rosemary, and red wine. I knew Julian wouldn't come. I had known it when I set the 3rd plate, but a man has to complete the structure before he tears it down. You have to give the foundation one final test to prove the dry rot is real. I sat at the table at 6 p.m. I watched the clock hand move. The house was completely quiet. Earl sat on the empty chair beside me, his tail twitching. At 8:14, the phone rang. It was the phone call that started everything I have told you. The call where my son told me I had 2 choices: apologize to the Vances or live the rest of my life alone. "I hear you, Julian," I had said. "I appreciate the clarity." When I hung up the receiver, I felt no anger. I felt the absolute, cold peace of a man who had completed his final inspection. The foundation had failed. The structure was condemned. It was time to walk away. On the final night in the Dilworth duplex, February 6th, I walked through the empty rooms. The carpet had been cleaned, and the bare floorboards in the hallway echoed with the sound of my work boots. It was the same house I had lived in for over 30 years, but without Helen's things. The curtains she had sewn, the books on the shelves, the framed prints on the walls. It was just a collection of plaster and timber. I went to the kitchen. The solid oak table and chairs remained left for the Hendersons as agreed. I sat down at the table just for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. On the center of the wooden table, I placed 2 items. The first was the white letter-sized envelope addressed to Diana. It contained the notarized copies of the * Helen Miller Memorial Trust and my brief letter to her. The second was a small wooden box. Helen had bought it at a craft fair in Murfreesboro back in 2003, saying she wanted a place to store important things. I had teased her at the time, telling her everything she touched became an important thing, and she had laughed and swatted my arm with a dish towel. I had kept the box on my dresser since her funeral. Inside the box, I placed 3 things. First, the photograph of Julian's 9th birthday at Radnor Lake. He was sitting on my shoulders, his hands buried in my thick hair, laughing so hard his eyes were closed. It was a snapshot of a time when we were a family, before the wealth and the Vances had carved a chasm between us. Second, the wedding photograph of Helen and me from 1987. We were standing outside the courthouse, rice in her hair, our faces bright and certain of the future. I wanted Julian to remember the two people who had started all of this with $400 in a dream. Third, a small black flash drive. On it was a single video file. I had recorded it on my phone on the night of my 68th birthday. It was a simple, unedited video of the kitchen. The camera panned from the ticking clock on the wall to the cold pot roast on the stove, and finally to the table set for 3 people, before showing me sitting alone in the silence, blowing out a single candle on an uncut birthday cake. I didn't say a word in the video. I didn't need to. The silence spoke for itself. I closed the brass latch of the box and left it sitting dead center on the table. It was impossible to miss. The next morning, Tuesday, February 7th, I woke at 6 lung. I made one last cup of coffee in a disposable cup, drank it standing by the sink, and then picked up my green canvas duffel bag. Alice Weaver was waiting on the front porch when I walked out. The morning air was freezing, and the lawn was white with frost. She stood there in her gray coat and wool scarf, her eyes red-rimmed. "You eat?" she asked, her voice carrying its familiar, no-nonsense dry quality. "Toast," I lied. "That's not eating, Gerald," she said, but her voice cracked. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, hugging me with a strength that pressed the air from my lungs. She was crying, her shoulders shaking against my chest. "Just come back sometime, okay?" she whispered into my shoulder. "Even if it's 10 years from now, even if you're 100 years old and you need someone to cut your grass, just come back to Dilworth." My throat closed so fast I couldn't speak. I squeezed her hand, feeling the small, cold fingers. "I'll try, Alice," I managed to say. "I promise." She nodded several times, forcing a smile, and then let go. I walked down the stone path, locked the front door, and slid the spare key under the welcome mat for Gary Porter's walkthrough with the Hendersons later that morning. My own keys were already sitting in a sealed envelope at Brenda Stone's office. I stood at the edge of the driveway and looked at the duplex one last time. I looked at the dark green shutters I had painted the summer Julian turned 13, and the mature oak tree Helen had planted as a sapling when we first moved in. The tree was taller than the roof now. 40 years, I whispered to the oak. Good house. Pastor Walter Davis was parked at the end of the driveway in his old Navy Ford truck, the engine running and the heater blowing. He had a gospel station set playing low on the radio. When I dropped into the passenger seat and threw my duffel bag in the back, he looked at me with the quiet, understanding gaze of a man who had shared 40 years of my life. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," I said. He pulled out of the driveway, and we drove down the familiar streets of Charlotte for the last time. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks blocking lanes, joggers on the sidewalks, coffee shops opening their doors. Charlotte was completely indifferent to the fact that Gerald Miller was making the most important drive of his life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "You sure about this, Jerry?" Walter asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "I want him to know when he finds the accounts," I said. "Not before." I typed a short message slowly, verifying every letter before hitting send. "I found the third option, Julian. I hope one day you find yours." Daddy sent the message at 11:03 a.m. as we crossed the bridge over the Catawba River, the Charlotte skyline disappearing in our rearview mirror. Exactly 37 seconds later, my phone began to buzz in my hand. Julian's name lit up the screen. My heart gave a single hard thud against my ribs. My thumb hovered over the green button, but I didn't slide it. I watched the screen flash until it went black, and then the voicemail notification appeared. "You going to listen to it?" Walter asked. "No," I said quietly, turning the phone face down on my knee. "I don't need to. He's going to be angry," Walter said, his voice flat, "simply stating a fact. And then he's going to be very scared when he realizes what you've done with the estate." "I know," I said, looking out the passenger window at the rolling Carolina hills. "And then maybe he'll finally have to think about what kind of man he wants to be." We arrived at the departures drop-off at Charlotte International Airport at 12:31 in the afternoon. Walter put the Ford truck in park and sat for a moment, both hands still resting on the steering wheel, watching the stream of travelers dragging their suitcases toward the glass doors. "You call me when you land," he said, turning his head to look at me. "Every stop. You promised. And Jerry, Eat something at the terminal. Don't just drink coffee." "Yes, Sir Reverend," I said, a faint smile touching my face. Walter almost smiled back. He reached over and gripped my shoulder with one hand, his fingers digging into the wool of my jacket. His grip was still firm and strong, the grip of a man who had spent his youth swinging a framing hammer. "Go live, Gerald," he said quietly. I got out of the truck and grabbed my canvas duffel bag from the floorboard. The terminal doors slid open, a blast of warm, recycled air and the hum of voices hitting me in the face. I walked inside without looking back. I had my boarding pass on my phone, my ID in my pocket, and 40 years of something heavy lifting off my chest with every single step. As I stood in the security line, my mind drifted to the timing of what was about to unfold in Charlotte. I knew Julian's schedule, and I had calculated the exact order in which the dominoes would fall. He would notice the bank accounts first. It would likely happen on Thursday, when the automatic mortgage payment for their Myers Park home was scheduled to clear. The mortgage was linked to a joint operating account I had kept open for years, which I funded monthly. Julian had never bothered to check the balance. He just assumed the money was always there. But that account was now closed, the funds wired to the irrevocable trust. When the bank notified him that the transaction had failed due to a closed account, he would log in. He would find nothing, a balance of zero. Then he would call the Miller & Sons office in a panic. He would reach the front desk, expecting to be put through to my personal cell phone or to Leon. But Leon had strict instructions from Brenda Stone. The receptionist would tell him, in the polite, neutral tones of a trained professional, that Gerald Miller had retired and resigned as manager, and that all corporate inquiries were now being handled by Brenda Stone's law firm. Julian would call Brenda, but Brenda wouldn't take his call. Her assistant would tell him that Miss Stone was out of the office, and that any inquiries must be submitted in writing. By Friday, Julian would drive down to the Dilworth duplex, convinced I had suffered a medical emergency or a sudden mental breakdown. He would pull his sleek luxury car into the gravel driveway. He would walk up the stone path, reaching for his key. But his key wouldn't turn in the lock. The locksmith had changed the cylinders the morning of the closing. Julian would knock, furious and confused. And the door would be opened not by his father, but by Linda Henderson, holding a toddler on her hip, with moving boxes stacked in the hallway behind her. She would tell him that she and her husband had purchased the duplex from Gerald Miller on February 7th, and that the house was no longer ours. I wondered how Julian would react when Linda handed him the wooden memory box. I had instructed Gary Porter to tell the Hendersons to give the box and the envelope to Julian or Diana if they came looking. I wondered if he would play the video on the flash drive. I wondered if, when he heard my voice in that quiet kitchen, watching the single candle burn down next to the cold pot roast, he would finally understand what the word alone actually felt like from the inside. The security line moved forward, and I moved with it, placing my duffel bag in the gray plastic bin. Outside the tall glass windows of the terminal, the Carolina sky was flat, white, and wide open. I took a deep breath, the air clean and free in my lungs. I looked up at the clouds. "Helen, my love," I whispered, "watch me now." The flight to Portland, Maine was quiet. I sat by the window watching the green forests and winding rivers of the East Coast slide past below. The land looked small from 30,000 feet, the roads and houses like toys arranged by a child. It made the conflicts of Myers Park feel distant, almost insignificant. We landed in Portland late in the afternoon, the ground covered in thick sheets of white snow. The air outside the terminal was freezing, a sharp, biting cold that felt completely different from the damp winter chill of Charlotte. It was a clean cold. It didn't apologize for itself. It just arrived and did its work. I rented a cheap sedan and began the 45-minute drive south to Kennebunkport. The roads were bordered by tall pines, their branches heavy with snow, and the ocean appeared occasionally on my left, a dark, churning gray under the winter sky. I arrived at the cottage at 5:30 p.m. It was a small, shingled building sitting on a rocky point overlooking the harbor. The windows were small, the roof steep, and the porch faced east toward the open Atlantic. Abigail, my landlord, was waiting for me. She was a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, with silver hair tied in a practical bun and the quiet, reserved manner of someone who respected other people's privacies as a matter of principle. She handed me the brass key without a word of curiosity, charged me the first month's rent in cash, and then pointed to a basket of homemade blueberry jam on the kitchen counter. "The heater is on," she said, her voice dry. "The wood box is full. Call if the pipes freeze." "Thank you, Abigail," I said. She nodded once and walked out, her boots crunching in the snow. I locked the door, dropped my duffel bag on the wooden floorboards, and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the Atlantic was throwing itself against the dark granite rocks, a relentless, roaring voice that filled the cottage. It was a cold, unforgiving body of water, but it was honest. I made a cup of black coffee in a heavy ceramic mug and stood by the glass, watching the lobster boats bobbing at the docks in the fading light. I had vanished. I had been in Kennebunkport 10 days when the phone finally rang. Those first 10 days had been the quietest of my adult life. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet I had felt in the Dilworth duplex after Helen passed. It was a clean silence, the kind that settles over a frozen landscape before dawn. I woke at 6:15 every morning, just as I had for 4 decades. But instead of reaching for my boots or checking my phone for text messages and project updates, I simply sat at the small kitchen table. I made a single cup of black coffee, poured it into the heavy ceramic mug Clara from the Elm Street Bakery had given me, and watched the gray Atlantic. In the evenings, I read books I had bought at a local shop. I walked the harbor path in the freezing winter air, the wind off the ocean biting my face, and I sat on the snow-covered benches. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was learning what it felt like to be a person rather than a business function. I wasn't Gerald Miller, the manager of Miller & Sons. I was just an old man in a wool coat, watching the lobster boats move in the harbor. Then, on a Tuesday morning at 7:03, exactly 10 days after I had boarded the flight in Charlotte, my phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at the screen. It was Alice Weaver. I picked it up, expecting her dry, familiar voice, but her tone was careful, carrying the soft geography of a woman delivering news she knew would leave a scar. "Gerald," she said quietly, "Julian went to the Miller & Sons office yesterday, and before that he was at the bank." I set my coffee mug on the table. The Atlantic was doing what it always did outside the window, waves slamming against the dark granite. "I expected it," I said. "It's been 10 days. The bank accounts, I assume?" "Nearly empty," Alice confirmed. He called the bank first, trying to figure out why the mortgage payment failed. They told him the accounts had been closed. He drove straight to the office on Moorhead Street. The receptionist told him you had retired and that the management had transferred all inquiries to Brenda Stone. "Did he call Brenda?" I asked. "He did," Alice said. "Brenda didn't take his call. Her assistant told him to put any questions in writing. So he drove down to the Dilworth duplex. I saw his luxury car pull into the driveway from my kitchen window. I gripped the phone, my knuckles going slightly white. "He went to the house." "He did," Alice said. "He tried his key first. I watched him stand at the door for 2 minutes, turning it, shaking the handle. He looked confused, Gerald. Really confused. Then he knocked. Linda Henderson opened the door. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Julian's shoulders went rigid. He stood there for a long time, looking past her into the hallway at the moving boxes. "Did Linda give him the envelope?" "She gave him the box first," Alice said. "And the envelope. He took them, walked back to his car, and just sat in the driver's seat. He didn't drive away. He sat there for 20 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. Gerald, he didn't look angry." "No," I asked. "No," Alice's voice dropped. I expected him to be furious, but he wasn't. You know that sound a person makes when they reach for something that has always been in the exact same place, and their hand finds nothing but empty air? That specific shock that is more confused than angry? That's how he looked. Like a man who just realized the floor he had been walking on was glass the whole time, and he had been stomping on it without once looking down. A sharp contraction pulled tight in my chest. It wasn't guilt, and it certainly wasn't satisfaction. It was just that specific clean ache that comes from loving a child for 38 years and watching a consequence you set in motion finally land on him. He's alone, I whispered. Diana wasn't with him, Alice confirmed. He came alone. I think he needed to find out by himself. Good, I said. Some things a man has to look at without an audience. Gerald, Alice said softly after a pause. Are you all right? It was the same question she had asked me over coffee mugs on the porch step in Dilworth. Ask me in an hour, Alice, I said, using the same answer I always gave when my heart was too full to sort through the words. Same as always, she said quietly. Same as always, I agreed. After she hung up, I stayed at the kitchen window, watching the dark water. The sky was gray, the snow falling in silent, heavy flakes. I pictured Julian sitting in his car in the Dilworth driveway, holding the wooden box Helen had bought at the craft fair, with the Hendersons moving boxes sitting inside the house where he had grown up. I hoped he would open the box. I hoped that when he saw the Radnor Lake photo and the wedding picture, and played the video of his father blowing out birthday candles in the quiet kitchen, he would understand the architecture of what had happened. I hadn't done this to punish him. I hadn't done it to destroy him. When a structure is rotting, you don't patch the drywall. You tear it down to show the owner the rot in the beams. I wanted my son to see the rot in his own life. I wanted him to see what he had been willing to trade for the approval of the Vances and the comfort of Windsor Farms. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway, staring out at the lobster boats bobbing in the harbor as the first winter storm of the seasons began to move in from the east. Julian's realization didn't come in a single, sudden moment. It came in pieces, a series of locked doors that he hit one after another until he was forced to stand in the wreckage of his own expectations. Brenda Stone called me on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after my phone call with Alice. Outside, the Kennebunkport snow was melting under a weak February sun, the water dripping from the eaves of the cottage. Julian visited the office on Moorhead Street yesterday, Brenda said, her voice businesslike and dry. Leon called me immediately after he left. I thought you should know how the meeting went. Tell me, I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Julian arrived at 10 in the morning, Brenda said. Leon said he looked disheveled. His tie was loose, his jacket unzipped. He walked straight past the receptionist and entered your old office, only to find the desk empty and the file cabinets locked. Leon had been with Miller & Sons for 18 years. He had seen Julian grow up, from a boy who sat in the truck eating sandwiches to a man who wore tailored suits and looked at the crews with polite distance. Leon wasn't intimidated by Julian's corporate title. Where is my father, Leon? Julian had demanded, his voice tight. The bank says his personal accounts are closed and the joint business account is gone. Gary retired, Julian, Leon had said calmly, sitting behind his own desk. He signed the papers last week. He's no longer the manager of Miller & Sons. That's impossible, Julian said, his face going pale. He can't just retire. The company charter, I'm the successor. My name is on the company, Miller & Sons. I'm the son. Leon had looked at him for a long moment, a heavy silence hanging in the room. Leon felt a mixture of pity and frustration, seeing the boy he had known reduced to this frantic confusion. The name on the truck is just paint, Julian, Leon said quietly. Your father built this business. He was the sole member of the LLC. He had the right to transfer it to whoever he chose, and he chose to transfer it to a trust and a sanctuary. What sanctuary? Julian raised his voice. Who is running this place? A professional management board, Leon said. And the profits are going to support elderly housing. If you want the technical details, you'll have to talk to Brenda Stone. I'm just the foreman. My job is to make sure the crews show up and the properties are managed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a job site to inspect on Moorhead. Julian had stormed out of the office, his heels clicking loudly on the concrete stairs. From there, he had driven to the Bank of America branch in Dilworth on East Boulevard, the same branch Helen and I had used since 1987. He had demanded to speak with the branch manager, demanding to know why a joint operating account had been closed without his signature. The manager, a woman who had known Helen and me for 20 years, had escorted him into her office. She had laid the paperwork on the desk. The account was closed by the primary owner, Gerald Miller Julian, she explained gently. Under the account agreement, The primary owner has the absolute right to close the account and withdraw the funds at any time without joint consent. The funds were wired directly to an irrevocable trust. What trust? Julian asked, his voice shaking. Who is the trustee? I can't disclose the details of the trust, Julian, she said. You are not listed as a trustee or a beneficiary. Legally, the funds no longer belong to your father and they do not belong to you. But the mortgage, Julian said, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. The mortgage payment failed. My credit. The bank sent a notification to the address on file 2 weeks ago, the manager said. It was sent to the Dilworth house. Julian had sat in the manager's office for 5 minutes, staring at the closed account documents. He had lived his entire life, with the quiet, unshakable assumption that my money was his money. He had built his entire career, his partnership track, and his social standing in Myers Park on the foundation of my labor. He had promised Leonard Vance a $150,000 investment in their new real estate fund, using my company's reserves as his security, and now the foundation was gone. He looked like he was suffocating, Gerald, Brenda said on the phone. He called my office 4 times yesterday. My assistant gave him the standard response. Put it in writing. He's realized there are no loopholes. The LLC transfer is filed with the Secretary of State, and the irrevocable trust is protected under North Carolina General Statutes Section 36C5501. There is no legal path for him to challenge any of it. Thank you, Brenda, I said. He's going to the house next, she warned me. I know, I said. He's already been there. Alice called me. How are you holding up, Gerald? I'm looking at the ocean, Brenda, I said. The water is cold, but the view is clear. I hung up the phone and walked out onto the porch of the cottage. The air was crisp, the scent of salt and pine needles heavy in the wind. I leaned against the wooden railing, watching a lone lobster boat move out past the harbor breakwater, its engine a low, rhythmic hum in the quiet afternoon. I thought about Julian. I thought about the boy who used to sit on my shoulders at Radnor Lake, his hands in my hair. I wondered if he was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the polished suits, the country club memberships, and the cold, bloodless ambition of Myers Park. I had given him the third option. Now, it was up to him to decide what to do with it. Alice Weaver called me on Saturday evening. The snow in Kennebunkport had turned to a light, freezing drizzle, the ice clicking against the window glass like tiny fingernails. Julian came back to the house today, Gerald, she said, her voice dropping. I watched him from my kitchen window. He pulled his car into the gravel driveway, right where your truck used to sit. He sat in the driver's seat for 5 minutes before he got out. Tell me what happened, Alice, I said. He walked up the path, his shoulders hunched against the cold, she said. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his key ring, and tried to insert the key into the deadbolt. I could see him trying to force it, turning his wrist, shaking the door handle. When it wouldn't turn, he stepped back, looking at the door as if it had betrayed him. Then he knocked, hard. Alice paused, the sound of her drinking tea audible on the line. Linda Henderson opened the door, she continued. She was holding her little boy on her hip. Julian stood there, completely still. I could see the shock on his face from across the street. He looked past her into the foyer, seeing their moving boxes and the unfamiliar furniture. He said something, and Linda nodded, then stepped back inside for a moment. She came back to the door holding the white envelope and the wooden memory box you had left on the kitchen table. He took them, Alice said. He didn't say another word. He walked back to his car, holding the wooden box under one arm and the envelope in his hand. He got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and just sat there. Gerald. I watched him for 30 minutes. He didn't drive away. He just sat in that car in the gravel driveway. What Julian did in that car was something I would only learn months later, when the fragments of his breakdown were pieced together. Julian had sat in the cold car, the heater off, staring at the name written on the front of the envelope. Deanna. It wasn't addressed to him. I had bypassed him entirely, writing directly to his wife because she was the one carrying my grandchild, the only one who hadn't spoken the words of betrayal. Then he looked at the wooden memory box. He traced the grain of the oak lid, the wood worn smooth by Helen's hands over 20 years. He released the brass latch and opened the lid. First, he pulled out the photograph of his 9th birthday at Radnor Lake. He stared at his own face, small and laughing, sitting on my shoulders with his hands buried in my hair. He looked at the background, the gold autumn leaves reflecting on the lake. He remembered that day. He remembered how his legs had ached from the walk and how I had lifted him without a word, carrying him for 2 miles back to the Ford truck. He remembered the security of knowing his father would never let him fall. Second, he pulled out the wedding photograph of Helen and me from 1987. He looked at his mother's face, young, healthy, and laughing, standing outside the courthouse with rice in her hair. It was the face of the woman who had spent her dying days in a hospital bed, begging me to take care of him, but to take care of myself too. Third, he found the small black flash drive. Julian had his work laptop sitting in the passenger seat. He opened it, booted the system, and plugged the drive into the USB port. He opened the file manager. There was only one file, January 19th. MP4. He double-clicked it. The video began in silence. The camera was steady, showing the kitchen of his childhood home. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, the same low hum he had heard every morning growing up. The camera panned slowly across the kitchen wall, landing on the calendar Helen had hung, showing the red circle around the date, January 19th. Then the camera panned to the stove. It showed the pot roast sitting in the pan, the lid slightly askew, the steam no longer rising. It was cold. Finally, the camera settled on the kitchen table. It showed the 3 chairs pulled out, the 3 plates set, the 3 sets of silver shining under the kitchen light. In the center of the table was the birthday cake from the bakery. Still inside its cardboard box, the white string untied. The camera angle shifted, showing me sitting alone at the head of the table. I looked tired, my face lined with the years, but my expression was entirely calm. I reached out, struck a match, and lit the single candle on the cake. I sat there in the silence, watching the small flame flicker for 10 seconds. Then I leaned forward and blew it out. The video ended. The screen went black. Julian sat in his car in the gravel driveway on Englewood Avenue, his hands resting on the keyboard of his laptop. He didn't move. He didn't check his phone. According to Alice, when he finally got out of the car to put the box in his trunk, his shoulders were shaking. He didn't look like the polished investment partner from Myers Park anymore. He looked like a boy who had walked into his own home, only to find the door locked, the windows dark, and the key gone forever. He drove away slowly, his car slipping on the wet gravel. He wasn't angry, Jerry. Alice whispered on the phone. He looked like he was grieving. He looked like he had finally realized what he had traded away. I know, Alice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know. I hung up and stood in the dark kitchen of the cottage. The Atlantic was roaring outside, the waves throwing themselves against the rocks with a relentless, heavy force. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the cottage wrap around me. It was the same silence Julian had seen in the video, the silence of a choice made and a consequence delivered. Pastor Walter Davis called me on a Tuesday evening. It was the first call he had made to me since he dropped me off at the Charlotte airport, which told me, before he even spoke, that what he had to say was too important to summarize in a text message. Julian came to see me today, Jerry, Walter said, his voice carrying the deep, unhurried calm of a pastor who spent his life counseling people through the dark corners of their lives. He went to Brenda Stone first, and then he came straight to the church. I sat down in the armchair by the kitchen window, looking out at the dark harbor. How did Brenda handle him? Professionally, Walter said, and I could hear the faint, dry humor in his voice. She laid out the trust documents, the corporate restructuring, and the will amendments. She explained that the entirety of your personal estate has been left to the Golden Years Housing Charity, and that he has zero claim to any of it. He read the codicil, Jerry, the note you left with it. I knew the note by heart. I had written and rewritten it 3 times until only the bare truth remained. For the fathers who weren't as lucky as I was, at least I had someone to lose. Brenda said he read it twice, Walter continued. Then he set it down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he's not sure what to do with his hands. He sat in her office in silence for a long time. She said he looked like a man reading a blueprint for a house he had been living in for years, but had never actually seen from the outside. Did he ask about the company restructuring? I asked. He didn't need to, Walter said. Brenda told him it was completed in October 2022, 2 months after his wedding. He didn't ask why. I think when he heard the date, he immediately remembered the reception at the country club. He remembered what Leonard had said, and his own silence. He knew exactly why the foundation had been shifted. I let out a slow breath, my hand tightening on the phone, and then he came to you. He did, Walter said. He walked into my study looking like a man who had just read the final pages of his own life story and realized he didn't like the ending. He looked exhausted, Jerry. The polish was completely gone. He asked me if I knew about the plan, and I told him the truth. I told him you had called me on the night of your 68th birthday, that your mind was made up, and that I had helped you execute it. How did he take that? He was hurt, Walter said. He looked at me and asked, "Why did you help him, Walter? You've known me since I was a boy. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you warn me what he was planning to do?" "What did you tell him?" I asked, my heart beating in my throat. "I told him the truth, Julian." Walter's voice on the phone was steady, carrying no judgment, just the weight of 4 decades of ministry. I looked him in the eye and said, "Because you didn't ask, Julian. In 11 years, since your mother died, you have never once asked your father how he was doing in a way that required a real answer. You called on Sundays to talk about your job, your investments, and your wife's family, but you never actually saw him. Some questions, if you don't ask them for long enough, stop being available to you." The line went completely silent. I could hear the wind off the Atlantic whistling through the cracks in the cottage siding. "You said that to him?" I whispered. "He needed to hear it from someone who wasn't you, Jerry," Walter said gently. "Sometimes the truth only lands when it comes from outside the wound. If you had said it, he would have called you bitter or defensive. Hearing it from his pastor, from a man who loved his mother, made it impossible for him to dodge. What did he do?" "He sat there," Walter said. "He didn't argue. He didn't say it was unfair. He just sat in the chair for 10 minutes, staring at the floorboards. When he finally stood up to leave, he walked out to his car, got in, and sat there for another 15 minutes. He didn't make any phone calls. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat in the quiet of his own car, looking at the church doors." Walter paused, drawing a slow breath. "Gary, your son is beginning to grieve you while you're still alive." The words moved through me like cold Atlantic water, sharp, clarifying, and clean. "That's a strange thing to hear, Walter," I said. "It is," Walter agreed, "but it's not a bad thing. Grief is how we learn the value of what we've lost. He's going to try to find you, Jerry. He's already talking about hiring a private investigator. It's only a matter of time." "I know," I said. "I expected it, but I'm not ready to be found yet. If he finds me now, he'll be coming out of panic and desperation, not because he actually understands. He'll want his father back to fix his life, to restore his credit and his standing with the Vances. I need him to find himself first. Then he can find me." "I'll stay in touch," Walter said. "I'll let you know if he makes a move." "Thank you, Walter. For everything. For 40 years. "That's what 40 years is for, Jerry," he said simply. I hung up the phone and walked out onto the porch. The freezing rain had stopped, and the clouds were parting, revealing a cold white moon that turned the ocean into a sheet of silver and black. The Atlantic was roaring against the rocks below the cottage, a constant, honest voice that had no room for lies or polite pretenses. I leaned against the railing and looked out at the water. My son was grieving. He was standing in the empty space I had left behind, feeling the cold air where a father's love used to be. It was a hard path for him to walk, but it was the only one that led back to the man Helen and I had hoped he would become. I would wait. I would stay one step ahead of the trackers, and I would wait until he was ready. Walter called me on a Wednesday morning in mid-April. I was walking along the harbor path in Kennebunkport when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The air had finally lost its freezing edge, and the scent of salt and damp earth was heavy in the wind. "Roy Kelly filed his preliminary report yesterday, Jerry," Walter said, his voice flat. "He traced the flight from Charlotte to Portland. He has the Kennebunkport address. He knows you're renting Abigail's cottage. Roy Kelly was a private investigator based out of Charlotte, a thorough man who charged high rates and didn't leave many stones unturned. I had known Julian would hire someone. It was the logical move for a man who had money but no answers. "How much time do I have?" I asked, stopping to look at a gull riding the wind over the docks. "A week, maybe 10 days before Julian books a flight," Walter said. "He's been working late at the firm, trying to manage the real estate fund fallout, but he's determined to find you. Jerry, are you sure about this?" Staying ahead of him. Is there a point where staying gone stops being a statement and starts being stubbornness? It was a question only a friend of 40 years could ask. Walter knew the difference between my principles and my pride, and he was never afraid to call out the wrong one. "If Julian finds me because he hired a private investigator and flew to Maine in a panic," I said, my voice steady, "then nothing has changed. He gets his father back because he is scared of his credit failing, or because he wants to salvage his reputation. He doesn't get his father back because he understands what he did. In 5 years, we'd be sitting in the same kitchen, having the same argument. I need him to find himself, Walter. Then he can find me." Walter was silent for a long moment, the hum of the line carrying the weight of his thoughts. "All right," he said finally. "What do you want me to tell him if he asks?" "Tell him I'm well," I said. "That's enough. I had already planned for this. Back in February, when I first settled into Kennebunkport, I had realized that this cottage was a breadcrumb rather than a destination. I had spent my life building structures, and you never build a house without a second exit. I had already identified a second cottage further north, in a small town called Stonington on Deer Isle. It was a lobster fishing village with a name nobody in Myers Park would ever recognize. But I didn't want to leave Julian with nothing. I wanted to leave him a message, but not an address. A week before Walter's call, I had been sitting in the harbor coffee shop. A local lobsterman named George, a man with a face like weathered leather and a quick laugh, had sat down across from me. He had become a friend over the last 2 months, the kind of friend who didn't ask about your past but was always ready to tell you about the storm of 1987. George had a camera sitting on the table. He had picked it up, adjusted the lens, and taken a photo of me without asking. Right as I was laughing at a story he had told about a local harbor master. Later, he had printed the photo and handed it to me. I had looked at the print, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man staring back. It wasn't the tired, defensive Gerald Miller who had stood on the Myers Park porch in the freezing rain. It was a man with a bright, open smile, his eyes wrinkling at the corners, holding a mug of coffee by a sunlit harbor window. I looked free. I looked like the version of myself that had existed before 11 years of Christmas parties and silent birthday tables. I printed a copy of that photograph and placed it inside a white envelope. I didn't write a letter. I didn't leave an explanation. The truest thing I could tell my son about where I was wasn't a physical address. It was that photograph. On Sunday morning, I packed my canvas duffel bag. I said goodbye to Abigail over coffee in her kitchen. She had that quiet Maine quality of respecting a tenant's business, asking nothing, offering what was needed. I handed her the cash for the final cleaning and laid the white envelope on her kitchen table. "A man might come asking for me, Abigail," I told her. "His name is Julian. He's my son. If he comes, please give him this." Abigail looked at the envelope, then looked at me, her gray eyes calm. "I will," she said. "Thank you, Abigail," I said. I walked out of the cottage, threw my duffel bag into the rental sedan, and began the drive north. The road wound along the coast, the pine forests giving way to granite cliffs and the open, endless ocean. I crossed the high suspension bridge onto Deer Isle, looking down at the swirling green waters of the Reach. The air was thick with the scent of salt, wet seaweed, and wood smoke. Stonington was a small harbor town, clinging to the edge of the granite island. The houses were weathered, the docks busy with lobster traps, and the water was a deep, cold blue. I rented a one-bedroom cottage from a retired fisherman named Silas. He communicated mostly in brief nods and short sentences, charged by the month, and didn't even own a computer or a television. He was a man who let the weather do the talking. I found him entirely restful. I settled in quietly, learning the rhythms of the cove. I watched the lobster boats head out before dawn. Their engines a low hum in the dark. I read more. I cooked better than I had in years. I bought a notebook and started writing, not a journal, just thoughts and memories that rose to the surface once the noise of the old life was gone. I was 68 years old, and I was finally learning how to live. Julian flew to Maine in late April, exactly 9 days after my departure from Kennebunkport. I received the details of his visit from Abigail, who called me on a Sunday afternoon. She had promised to keep me informed, and she delivered the details in her dry, methodical Maine voice, describing the scene with the clarity of a witness in a courtroom. He arrived at the cottage at 2 in the afternoon, Abigail said. A rental car, a dark sedan. He walked up the path, his coat collar turned up against the harbor wind. He knocked on the door. When nobody answered, he stood on the porch for a long time, looking through the kitchen window. "Did he knock on your door next?" I asked, sitting on my small porch in Stonington, watching the lobster boats return in the late afternoon sun. "He did," she said. "He walked across the lawn to my house. He looked tired, Gerald. His boots were covered in mud, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He asked if Gerald Miller was still renting the cottage." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you had left," she said simply. "I told him you had packed your duffel bag, cleaned the kitchen, and moved on." He stood on my porch steps, staring at me as if he couldn't quite process the words. He asked where you went. I told him I didn't know. That was the truth, Gerald. You only told me you were going north. You didn't give me an address. "And the envelope?" I asked. "I handed it to him," Abigail said. "I told him you had left it for a man named Julian. He took it, looked at his name written on the front, and his hands started to shake. He walked back to his rental car, sat on the hood, and opened it." Julian had sat on the hood of the car, the wind off the Kennebunkport harbor blowing his hair, and pulled the photograph out of the white envelope. He didn't find a map. He didn't find a letter explaining my anger or outlining the terms of my return. He only found the print George the lobsterman had taken. He saw his father sitting by a harbor window, holding a ceramic mug, laughing with a freedom and happiness he had never once seen in my face during all his years in Myers Park. He saw a man who had laid down the burden, a man who had found something he hadn't even known he had lost. According to Abigail, Julian sat on the hood of that car, staring at the photograph for 15 minutes. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't pacing or shouting. He just sat there, holding the print with both hands, the harbor wind flapping the edges of the paper. When he finally got back into his rental car, he drove away slowly, heading south toward Portland and the flight back to Charlotte. Walter called me 3 days later to report the aftermath of Julian's return to Charlotte. "He came back a different man, Jerry," Walter said, his voice quiet. "I met with him yesterday. He didn't talk about hiring another private investigator. He didn't talk about filing lawsuits or trying to break the trust. I think that photograph broke something in him, but in a good way. It showed him that you weren't running or hiding. You were just living." "What did he say, Walter?" I asked. "He told me he had Leonard Vance over for dinner," Walter said. "A formal dinner at their Myers Park house. Leonard had started in on him, demanding to know what he was going to do about the failed real estate fund investment, and advising him to sue Brenda Stone's firm for malpractice. Julian had stood up, looked his father-in-law in the eye, and told him to leave. My chest pulled tight, a sudden, warm swell of emotion that made my eyes go hot. "He stood up to Leonard?" "He did," Walter said. "Julian told him that the investment was his own mistake, and that he would manage the financial loss himself without Vance interference. He told Leonard that his father's estate was none of their business and that they would never discuss it again in his home." "And Diana?" "Diana stood by him," Walter said. "She walked Leonard to the door herself. I think she had been waiting for Julian to stand on his own 2 feet for a long time. They're selling the Myers Park house, Jerry. They're moving into a smaller place in Plaza Midwood. Julian resigned from the partner track at his investment firm. He took a position as a regular advisor, working fewer hours so he can be home with Diana." I leaned against the porch railing in Stonington, looking out at the deep, cold blue of the Reach. The sun was setting, throwing long, gold shadows across the granite rocks. Julian was dismantling his own structure. He was tearing down the Windsor Farms ambitions and the Vance expectations, clearing away the rot to find the foundation of the man he actually wanted to be. He was facing the financial loss and the social fallout without my money to shield him, and he was doing it with his head held high. "He's growing up, Jerry," Walter said gently. "It's a hard process, but he's doing the work." "I'm glad, Walter," I said, my voice thick. "I'm genuinely glad. I'll keep you posted." Walter said, "Take care of yourself up there." "I will," I said. I hung up the phone and walked down to the Stonington docks. The air was cold, the scent of kelp and diesel fuel rising from the water. I watched the lobstermen unloading their catch, their voices carrying over the water in low, rhythmic grunts. I felt a quiet, solid pride settling into my bones. I hadn't saved my son by giving him a construction inheritance or a safety net. I had saved him by choosing the third option. I had forced him to face the silence, and in that silence, he was finally finding his own way back to the light. I would wait. The summer was coming, and I would wait. The summer in Stonington passed with the slow, predictable rhythm of the tides and the smell of wild roses along the dirt roads. I spent my days walking the granite coastline, reading on the porch under the morning sun and writing in my leather notebook. The local fishermen had gotten used to my presence. They no longer looked at me as a stranger from the south. I was just Jerry, the retired contractor who lived in Silas's cottage and liked his coffee black. My hands, which had spent 4 decades covered in calluses and concrete dust, were softer now. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The constant hum of worry that had occupied my head in Charlotte had completely evaporated, replaced by the deep, steady voice of the ocean. On a Tuesday morning in August, the phone on my writing desk buzzed. I saw Walter's name, and my hand tightened on my coffee mug before I picked it up. "Jerry," Walter said, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard in months. "Diana had the baby. August 14th. He arrived 5 weeks early, but both mother and child are home now, and they are completely healthy." I exhaled slowly, a long breath I felt I had been holding since February. I stood up and walked to the porch window, looking out at the sun reflecting off the harbor water. "Boy or girl, Walter?" I asked, my voice slightly thick. "A boy," Walter said. "They named him Leo Gerald Miller." I gripped the wooden window frame. Leo, after Helen's father, a quiet railroad engineer who had taught me how to read blueprints, and Gerald, after my own name. Both names were now carried by a tiny boy who had been stubborn enough to arrive 5 weeks early and strong enough to survive it. "Leo Gerald," I whispered, the name feeling heavy and beautiful in my mouth. "He's a beautiful boy, Jerry," Walter said gently. "Julian is a good father. I went to their new house in Plaza Midwood yesterday to drop off some food from the church. Julian was sitting in the nursery, holding the baby against his chest. He looked exhausted, but his eyes, Jerry, he looks at that boy the exact same way you used to look at him when he was a baby." I walked out onto the porch and sat on the wooden step, letting the warm August wind blow across my face. Below the cottage, the lobster boats moved slowly in the cove, their engines a low, comforting hum in the afternoon sun. I pressed my hand over my eyes and let the feeling move through me, making no effort to manage or hide it. "I'm glad. Walter," I said when I could speak. "I'm genuinely glad." "Julian asked about you again," Walter said. "He didn't ask for an address. He just asked if you were happy. What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Walter said. "I told him you were looking at the ocean and that you looked free." He nodded, looked down at his son, and said, "Good. That's what he deserved." A tear slipped past my fingers, warm and clean, and I let it fall onto the granite step. "He's learning, Jerry," Walter said. "He's finding his own third option. I think he's going to be all right." "Thank you, Walter," I said. "Thank you for being there. Always, Jerry," he said. "Always." After I hung up, I went back inside the cottage. I sat at the wooden writing desk Silas had built from salvaged ship timber. I opened my notebook, picked up my pen, and began to write the letter. It was a letter I had been planning since the night of my 68th birthday, but I hadn't been ready to write it until now. I needed the weight of the summer to settle. I needed the birth of my grandson to give the words the proper foundation. I wrote slowly, dipping the pen into the ink, choosing every single word with the same precision I had used to lay tile or frame a roof when I was young. I didn't want a long letter. I had learned over 68 years that the most important documents are always the shortest. Contract specifications run to 50 pages. The things that actually matter fit on one. When I finished, I folded the single sheet of paper, placed it inside a white envelope, and wrote Julian's name and new address in Plaza Midwood on the front. But I didn't mail it. I set the envelope on the corner of the writing desk, next to my photograph of Helen. I had promised myself that I would wait 5 months before sending it. I wanted to wait until January 19th, my 69th birthday and the anniversary of the ultimatum. I wanted to give Julian 5 months with his own son before the letter arrived. I wanted him to spend 5 months waking up in the middle of the night to soothe a crying baby. I wanted him to spend 5 months holding that fragile life in his rough hands, feeling the terrifying, beautiful weight of being a father. I wanted him to understand the protective love that makes a man work 6 days a week, and the quiet ache of watching that child grow up and walk away. I wanted him to be a father before he had to think about what kind of son he had been. 5 months was the right amount of time. The letter would sit on my desk, a silent witness to the passage of the year, until the winter returned and the ocean turned gray again. I stood up, walked to the stove, and began making dinner. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the hills of Deer Isle, throwing long pink and orange ribbons across the water of the cove. I felt a deep, steady peace in my chest, the foundation solid and secure under my feet. I woke at 6:15 on a Monday morning in January. For a brief second, in that soft space between sleep and full waking, I didn't know where I was. I listened for the sounds of Dilworth, the distant hum of traffic on East Boulevard, the birds in the oak tree outside the window. But then I heard the water, the relentless, constant voice of the Atlantic pushing against the granite rocks below the cove, and I remembered. I was in Stonington, Maine, and I was 69 years old today. I got up, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet, and made coffee. I poured it into the heavy ceramic mug and sat at the writing desk. The white envelope was still sitting on the corner, exactly where I had left it 5 months ago next to Helen's photograph. Today was the day. 5 months had passed since Leo Gerald was born. Julian had spent 5 months learning what it meant to hold a fragile life in his hands, to feel the terror and the beauty of being a father. He had spent 5 months being a father before I forced him to think about what kind of son he had been. I picked up the envelope, feeling the single folded sheet of paper inside. It was a short letter, only a few sentences. I had learned over 69 years that the most important things in life don't require many words. Contract specifications and loan applications run to 50 pages. The things that actually matter fit on one. I read the copy I had written in my notebook one last time. Julian, you gave me 2 choices. I found a third. I hope one day you find yours. The ring stays with you. The photo stays with you. Everything I built with these 2 hands. The part that matters is already inside you, whether you claim it or not. Tell Leo about his grandmother. Tell him she planted an oak tree in the Dilworth yard that grew taller than the duplex, and that she was very proud of it. Daddy closed the notebook, took the envelope, and walked down to the small Stonington post office. The air was a crisp 20 degrees, the harbor water still and dark under a pale winter sky. The town was quiet, the lobster boats still tied to the docks. I walked along the main street, my boots crunching on the frozen snow. I passed the harbor shop where George had taken the photo of me laughing. I passed the hardware store where I had bought hinges for Silas's screen door. I felt like I belonged here, not as Gerald Miller the builder, but just as Gerald. I entered the post office. The local postmaster, a retired Coast Guard named Mark, looked up from his desk and smiled. "Morning, Gerald," Mark said, his voice carrying the slow, dry Maine drawl. "Heading south? Just the letter, Mark," I said, handing him the envelope. He looked at the address in Charlotte, North Carolina. He didn't ask questions. He just slid it across the scale, stuck the stamps on, and dropped it into the outgoing bag. "Have a good birthday, Gerald," he said. "Thank you." "Mark," I said. I walked back to the cottage, the cold wind off the water clearing my lungs. The letter was gone. It was in the mail, heading south toward Charlotte, toward Plaza Midwood, toward my son. I knew it would arrive by Thursday. I wondered what Julian would do when he opened it. He would sit at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand, opening the envelope, reading the single page, reading it again. He might call the number Walter had. He might not. He might book a flight north, not out of panic or desperation, but because he was ready to sit on the porch and talk to his father. Or he might simply keep the letter in his desk drawer, a reminder of a lesson learned, and focus on being the father his own son deserved. Whatever he chose, it was his option to find. I had laid the foundation, poured the concrete, and secured the structure. The rest of the build was up to him. When you spend your life constructing buildings, you learn that you can't live in the house for the client. You can build it straight, you can make sure the roof doesn't leak, and you can inspect the foundation for rot, but once you hand over the keys, it's their house. They have to live in it. I sat on the porch step, wrapping my hands around my warm ceramic mug. The sun was coming up low and pale over the open ocean, throwing long silver and pink ribbons across the water of the cove. The light was clean, showing every rock, every wave, and every pine tree along the shore. I thought about Leo Gerald Miller, 5 months old, sleeping in a cradle in Charlotte, named after a grandfather he had never met. I thought about what it would feel like to hold him someday, to feel his small weight in my rough hands. I thought about whether I would ever see my son again. I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 3 years, the not knowing didn't bring any worry. I was at peace. I had made the hard choice, the one that had torn down the rotted structure of our old life so we could both start over on solid ground. I had taken care of my son and I had taken care of myself. I kept my promise, Helen, I whispered to the rising sun. The Atlantic kept pushing against the rocks, its voice low and constant, a relentless witness to the passage of time. I drank my coffee, the heat spreading through my chest, and I smiled. I was Gerald Miller. I was 69 years old. I owned nothing but my tools, my clothes, and the memories of the woman I loved, and I was completely free.